Neil Seeman, welcome to Paper Napkin Wisdom. I'm excited to have you with me today.
Thank you, Govin. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And you know what? I'm just going to say this for everybody listening. It's not all often that I get other Canadians on the podcast. Today, we're joined by Neil, who is in Toronto, and everybody knows I'm Canadian, so proud Canadian. It's nice to have another Canadian join me. So welcome to this show.
Thank you, Govin.
You shared a really interesting paper napkin with me, and I think it's ironic that we're talking about this on a podcast. But the napkin is empower quiet experts to change the world. Why did you share that with me?
Well, we hear a lot from loud people today, and no disrespect to loud folks. We hear them on social media. We hear them on the news. We hear them, dare I say it, in political forums. Sometimes they have something interesting to say, but increasingly, I've come to the conclusion and started a business, well, actually started two, focused on elevating what I call quiet voices. That was my technology business. And then now, quiet, quiet writers whose voices deserve to be amplified in a mill of several 100,000 English language books being published every day. And these are voices whose expertise is important for the world to hear.
That's amazing. So I think it's really interesting. You started off with loud people, right? Because I mean, loud people take up a lot of airspace. I mean, for lack of a better word. And the first thing that popped into my head was one of the forums is giving people this loud voice is Twitter, and Twitter is the constant nattering that goes on between birds, right? That's where the term initially starts. How do you, in the noise and the natter and all of that thing, how do you start to even, how do you find the quiet voices? Where are they?
Wow, you've asked the billion-dollar question right there. Impressive. So Govin, the company I started now, publicly traded risk monitoring firm, Rewe Corp, was fixated on that precise problem. Okay, so how do you mine the universe of data out in the world to collect quiet voices, people who are not talking on social media and elsewhere, to get a sense of what they think and need, right, in every country in the world? And so did that in the technology space. It was a really hard problem to solve. Invented what's called random domain intercept technology, originally used for pandemic surveillance, to do just that. In the context of authorship, which I'm doing now, look, it's non-scientific, but what I'm trying to do is identify people who are demonstrable experts. Okay, they fit a bunch of criteria. They've contributed over several decades to a field. They're deeply respected in that field, and they've mapped, just like my parents did. They've mapped their research onto other fields, and they need to make it generalizable for a wide international audience. And on top of that, layer in the fact that the business model is a cooperative model, such that we share in the costs and profits, just like book publishing used to be. And so they're entrepreneurial. So if they pass those markers, they fall into my bailiwick of interest.
I really find this interesting. So, and you said a lot, right? So they're demonstrable experts within one field, but they've been able to map it into another field. And I think, and then you snuck in a little bit about your parents, and your parents are renowned for having done this. For people listening, why don't you just talk about them for a second? Introduce them.
Thank you, Govin. It's a real honor to speak about my parents. My father, Philip Seaman, he passed away in January 2021. He discovered the dopamine receptors in the brain that are responsible for major mental illness, including schizophrenia, Parkinson's, and major addictions. People didn't take him seriously for 15 years until they all did. And then my mom, women's health, mental health pioneer, and psychiatric researcher, she died in April of this year, late April. I was her caregiver till the end. It was abrupt and challenging. She was also nonconformist. She was working with severely mentally ill patients in New York and Montreal and Toronto. And essentially, she felt that these individuals, women, were full human beings. And at the time, mainstream media were blaming mothers in particular for their child's mental health, mental illness. So what she did is put them in group therapy, and group therapy worked. So in both my parents' cases, they sort of looked at what was working and then worked backwards in different fields. And then it was really important for them to make their work accessible for a broader international audience.
Yeah, and so what they did was they took that expertise and made it relatable to people who may not have been experts. Was that your inspiration for Quiet? I mean, neither of them were quiet. They were very big on in terms of what they did. But was that what your inspiration was? That this idea that there's expertise that needs to be brought out,
It needs to be excavated. Yes, 100%. So I'm driven by
excavated. What a
my
great word.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, driven by my parents in every shape, form, and way. And I literally look at well, respectively at their certain of their obituaries and tributes every day of my life to make sure I've accomplished what they would consider of impact and value during that given day. Um, yeah, so it's not only expertise that needs to be excavated, it's also merit. Like merit is everywhere, and I'm sort of on this lifelong path to find people, really special people, and they're often quiet, and they deserve to be heard. And and yeah, so look, I'm working at the edges. I'm not going to be successful in eclipsing Twitter from the world, nor is that my ambition. Um, but what I'm learning is that a lot of people share this vision, and they really want to support me and my co-founder Ken Whitey, is a renowned historian and publisher, and and they really want to see us succeed.
It's amazing. So I want to go back a second because you talk about this idea of excavating, the quiet people, finding them, their expertise, but also merit. Some quiet people are quiet because they don't want the merit. They don't necessarily want to be elevated. What do you do to how do you handle that part of it?
Yeah, so there's a Latin expression, "Palmam qui ferat meruit," which one of my Latin scholar friends taught me, was that it literally translates to he the palm of merit who deserves it. How and it's used as a motto in schools and places around the world, but technically what it means is that we each have an obligation to try to find people of merit who deserve their voices amplified, and to try to help them. So we try to help them, we try to nudge them. But if they're resistant for whatever reason, and many people are, I've actually spoken with many would-be authors who, for a range of understandable reasons, don't want their story to be told. They want to keep it quiet, as you say, for a little bit longer. But often the case is that nobody's really approached them.
Mm.
They they've suffered from what's often referred to as imposter syndrome, and they don't feel that their story is a story that people want to hear. And in my view, I'm the sounding board for that.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Like that idea that people approach those quiet people with expertise approach their own expertise with skepticism, right?
Yeah, I mean that's
There's a
yeah.
humility behind that actually makes them more likable and maybe even more I don't want to say trustworthy, but maybe we should be paying more attention to it because of the fact that they're willing to stand behind their work, right? They care about it so much.
Yeah, I mean, humility is the seed of innovation and entrepreneurship and leadership, in my opinion. And to self-doubt, I think it's sort of the entrepreneur's superpower, if you will. And oftentimes, look, we're both entrepreneurs, serial entrepreneurs. We, like, people often can't make sense of us. um, And there's a whole sort of suite of things that binds us together. But point is that humility, like questioning and self-doubt, is actually, I think, an important criterion in detecting who's a quiet voice worth amplifying for the world.
I really like what you said when you said humility is the seed of innovation, and then went on to build curiosity. Do you find that in your in elevating and finding these quiet people, that humility and curiosity, this questioning that you called it, are closely tied? Is that
Yeah,
normal?
yeah. I mean, it's really hard. It's very, very hard to question assumptions that you hold really profoundly. Um, and especially in this age of misinformation, disinformation, echo chambers, and those who are humble are always questioning. And it, it's not that being a nonconformist is necessarily like um, uh, 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 always the right the right thing to be. I mean, sometimes it's important to think inside the box to accomplish certain things, but we really need to question why we always do things in a certain way. I mean, you're a renowned podcaster, okay? My earliest job was as a newspaper editor, print, and it was interesting because I remember at the time there there were all these people who just sneered at alternative media. I mean, really sneered. Like the idea that a podcast or a, well, the back then podcasts were not on the table, but at the time blogs were. They were just ascending in maturity. And I mean, really, like you were considered just out there if you thought that online media of any sort was going to grip the minds and hearts of a nation, of a community. And so yeah, you need to be humble even on topics that you're well versed in. um my father, for example, he 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 was but he was using brain neurochemistry, and then he taught himself genetics. He had to teach himself genetics, which he didn't take seriously for a long time. He thought the genome was overhyped as an invention, and then he taught himself genetics, and then he realized this was an important field. We're now seeing in the world of AI just that you need to be multifaceted and multidisciplinary and really understanding the future, and what innovation that can bear fruit.
I am I'm really struck by what you just shared about your father, right? You know, I think that in this loud people world, changing your mind, which is really what happened for your father, right? He changed his mind about the genome. Changing your mind is tantamount to lying. No, you didn't change your mind. You were lying all along. That's what loud people say. But you're saying something different. You're actually talking about things the way I think most people, reasonable people, would say it is. It's a discovery. It's questioning. And I love this line that you started that with, which is, it's hard to question assumptions that you hold profoundly. But we have to, right?
Yeah, you have to really stare deep into the often cold glass or abyss of your bias, to really challenge your assumptions. And look, some of the greatest minds in history, the film The Rashomon Effect by Kurosawa, got at this. The Einstein, in my view, thought about this. Um, John Maynard Keynes, the economist, he's quoted as saying, when the evidence changes, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?
Yeah,
That great question.
the profound quote, right? It's
Yeah,
profound.
yeah, yeah. So it, it's it's we sort of preserve this conceit of consistency. Okay, to be consistent, to be vituperative, to be angry, and that'll get you likes and followers, but it it doesn't really mean anything in the end.
And
And
that's so it's so really important, right? Having a brand is something that is unchanging, right? Like this idea that public figures, thought leaders, influencers, right? I mean, these are the loud people on
sure.
social media and loud people in the world, loud people in the blogosphere and everywhere else. These people have a brand, and that brand is unchanging in many cases, and that sort of speaks to a niche. What you're talking about is something much more expansive, much more, and so going back again to this these demonstrable experts who have taken and experiments in a field and applied it and mapped it to other fields. There's a little bit of humility, but attached to that, isn't there a little bit of imposter syndrome that people have to fight through?
Yeah, I think the other piece of it is authenticity. So the emerging brand that I feel that young people want to see in the workforce, and I experienced this as a founder, operator, CEO, working with a lot of young people who are questioning oftentimes loyalty. Retention is a big challenge for leaders today in any industry and recruitment, is authenticity. And does authenticity mean hewing to your bias all the time, or does authenticity actually mean leaning in to that with which you necessarily that sort of question? Um, and there's been funny things that I've questioned over the years. That sort of I've had to really lean into the data. I'm a data guy. Look, I'm a data geek. Lean into the data on feel, like on genres like romantasy or manga, or these sort of that are taking off, or sort of these comic style books, and I didn't really take them seriously, but you have to, again, you have to work backwards, use deduction, and say, okay, well, these themes, these genres are resonating with certain audiences, well, why? And then dip question it into it. It helps to transcend generations. I'm very fortunate to work and commingle with people who are of all different age groups. That's really valuable to me, and they're from different disciplines. I keep an office at Massey College at the University of Toronto, which is famous for its interdisciplinary nature and kind of a friendly democracy where you challenge each other's ideas over lunch and breakfast and such. And that helps.
Hmm. So you started when I talked about this sort of imposter syndrome thing, you went to authenticity as being the other side of it. And I find that authenticity, people find or perceive people authentic when they're willing to be transparent. So
Mhm.
the active part of it is not authenticity. It's not being authentic. It's being transparent, which people perceive as being authentic. And I think that's being able to express their fears. There's a series, and I'll wear my maple leaf on my shoulder for a second, and say there's a hockey series that was just released on Amazon. It's 6 episodes, and they delve into different storylines of the last hockey season. They followed 20 hockey players over the course of the year, like quarterback. That Netflix series called Quarterback, very much similar to that, but in hockey. And they followed 20 players. They whittled it down to, I think, 6 or 7. And that's what they put out. I haven't seen it all, but there's this piece around Connor McDavid, who is
Mhm.
ostensibly the best player in the world. I mean, the stuff that he can do is incredible. But he's a very private person. He's an introvert. He's a quiet person. He's a quiet expert.
Mhm.
He doesn't like to talk, and he shares in the series, in a segment that I did see, where he talks about how he's sort of uncomfortable with all of the attention that his expertise brings him. Like he knows that being this good at something gets him a lot of attention. And he's kind of uncomfortable with it, but he knows that he has to do it. He has to be there. Is that something that a lot of quiet experts have to get used to in that way? I'm not saying they're all Connor McDavid's, but you know.
Yeah. No, I'm in conversations with authors and prospective authors all the time on exactly this topic. That they're not used to what T.S. Eliot referred to as sort of etherizing themselves on a hospital table for the world to look at them, right?
Mm,
And the example of hockey is very interesting to me. I this is sort of sort of awkward for a Canadian to admit, but I don't follow hockey closely. But the one thing I did follow is there's been a fair bit of observation about how NHL players, Canadian hockey players, don't put themselves out on social media in comparison to their peers in the NFL or the NBA. And I sort of found that interesting. I was speculating, oh, is it because of Canadianism at play? I don't know, but I've always been intrigued by that. Um, you know, entrepreneurs are often like this too. We're the media, of course, shines a light on the spectacular successes and spectacular fails in entrepreneurship, right? Your
yeah.
Sam Bankman-Fried's, your Elizabeth Holmes in on the failure side, and then your colossal successes like Zuckerberg on another side, right? Like there's nowhere in between, and the reality is that entrepreneurship is everywhere in between, and there's all sorts of extraordinarily commercially successful entrepreneurs we've never heard of who are quiet and um, uh, worried about speaking too loudly. And I do think it's in part because um, they understand that a lot of their success has been okay, hard work. Yes, that's table stakes in entrepreneurship, but some of it has been luck. I was fortunate to be around in the early halcyon days of Web 1.0 and 96, and a whole range of us got engaged in these early stage companies, some of which shot up through the moon, and most of which crashed and bombed, and it's kind of everyone kind of knows that that the folks and the guys, and it was mostly guys, who kind of succeeded in the early days were playing lucky. So there's a bit of a sort of lack of or discomfort around that, I find, of authentic entrepreneurs versus the what I call the fast money entrepreneurs who are
Yeah.
they don't they're happy to boast about their big wins.
So let's talk about that leadership lesson or that entrepreneur lesson. You know, as quiet experts, because I think there are a lot of quiet experts that are entrepreneurs, right? I mean, and I think it also fits the visual of expertise that needs to be excavated. Now they've obviously excavated their expertise because they're running a business with it. They're doing something with it. But I think a lot of entrepreneurs are lonely. They are alone in their thoughts. They're alone in their fears. They're alone in the. Is that something that you see as a common thread with quiet experts? Is that something that comes along with that?
Yeah, and in the entrepreneurship world, and I brought voice to this in my last book, Accelerated Minds. It is that there's an epidemic of suicidal intent, highly elevated rates of bipolar, major depression disorder, intense anxiety, and this transcends across nations. And we don't really talk about it. Thankfully, thanks to the work of a range of people around the world. I was just a fringe player in this. Wrote a book about it, but others, um, uh, in particular, through the Founders Mental Health Pledge, led by Naveed Lalani and a number of other folks in the United States, got founders and entrepreneurs around the world to commit um, to certain resources at inception uh, to admit to their mental health frailties and do a number of other things that would have resources at play. So yes, it is. And thankfully, the stigma of mental health is something that is on the table today and widely discussed, unlike even, I must say, entrepreneurial mental health is something that was not discussed 5 years ago. But nowadays, it is. It's a weird thing in entrepreneurship. Vulnerability is the trait that many entrepreneurs sort of value most in their employees and their colleagues, but they're often afraid to be that way themselves because they're worried about how their investors might see them, or the public at large might see them, or their employees might see them, because they've sort of, they're often in this hole that makes them think that they have to be superhuman um, to thrive in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. But I think it's not so clear, actually. I think that you have to be you have to be authentic, and you have to be transparent and honest. And I saw this bear out during COVID. I don't know if you saw the data on this, but there was quite compelling data showing that business owners, small business owners, were the leaders that people gave the most trust to during the difficult time, the most difficult times. And it, obviously the livelihood was at stake, but that they could trust these leaders. And so it was a lot of small business owners that really stepped up. And these were I got to tell you, a lot of the quiet heroes of COVID were entrepreneurs behind the lines, calling their employees late at night, giving them comfort, taking lines of credit to support payroll and all that sort of thing. Um, I found that very interesting. We often think of trust in, like, in scientists and governments as fraying, and there's a fair bit of research around that. But at the same time, I think we do have a bedrock of trust in small business owners, and I think there's a reason for that. Entrepreneurs are inherently, if they do the right things, um, if they're authentic and real, they're the kinds of people that employees can trust and follow during a crisis.
Yeah, I firmly believe that profit follows contribution, and entrepreneurs who understand that contribution is the first part of that is really important. But it's also, I think, not to skirt over what you said earlier on, Neil, is that it's becoming more understood. Entrepreneurial mental health, small business owner mental health, and business on all entrepreneurs of all sizes mental health. It's really important to connect with peers. We were lucky. I mean, I had a conversation that I don't think I would have had 10 years ago with a woman by the name of Molly Booker, who's a suicide prevention specialist on Paper Napkin Wisdom. Recently recommend, if anybody is curious about how to support mental health of yourself or someone else, it's a great episode to check out. There's a lot of ground that we've covered, and a lot of things that I think we could continue to talk about. But most importantly, I go back to your paper napkin and empower quiet experts to change the world. What change can people be empowered to make? What change can these experts make?
So there's a few. I think one of them is to um, eh, demonstrate that their ideas are really accessible. So recently I've been learning about Swami Vivekananda, who brought Vedanta philosophy, to ancient Indian philosophy, to the West. And what was so fascinating about him was that he he wrote in English, not in Sanskrit, and he was able to make his words in English so accessible to the world. And so I think I'm in the academic sphere. I'm considered what's called a knowledge transfer expert, sort of a bit academies, but in this sphere, I think it's really important that these ideas that experts like my parents had, in the case of my mother, group therapy and other concepts. In the case of my father, working backwards, understanding that, okay, something about these neuroleptic drugs is working, and they became famous through the movie Awakenings with Robin Williams. Let's kind of figure out what is working. So like this kind of idea, like just to make them accessible to the world is important. The second thing is, I think we need to put authenticity on the map as something essential to expertise, and to our earlier discussion point, humility as being the seed of innovation, and testing norms, and sort of, instead of what Zuckerberg talks about, and he's recanted on this issue, breaking things fast, like kind of breaking norms slowly, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. I really think it's really important in a really loud world for us to think about and elevate the voice of the quiet experts in every room, and they're in every room and every team.
Absolutely.
They're
Just
everywhere.
one thing I commit to do, right, is every time, and despite my openness on this podcast, I'm actually quite a socially awkward person, and everyone who knows me knows this. So what I do is when I'm, at a social event, I just put it upon myself to always talk to the person who's quiet in the room, who's not speaking with anybody, and inevitably I learn something from them. And so these are little steps you can do. I think, people talk about quiet acts of kindness. I think that, small acts of kindness. I think one of the things we can do is just, overtures of invitation, right? And being receptive to other people's ideas, that may be different from ours.
That's a powerful place to end. Neil, thank you for joining me.
But thank you, Govin. This is fascinating. Thank you.